Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon and welcome. I hope you all are doing well. I'm Mark Sanders, professor of English and Africana Studies here at the University of Notre Dame, and I have the honor of chairing the Department of Africana Studies and directing the Initiative on Race and Resilience. And in that capacity, I have the honor of introducing today's event and our illustrious speakers. I'd like to start by acknowledging our presence on the traditional homelands of several Native peoples, including the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for many hundreds of years and continue to do so. If you haven't already done so, please silence your cell phones. The order of the conversation will be the following. We're starting a bit late, but we're okay. We'll have about 45 minutes or so of conversation among the four panelists, and then we'll have about 20 minutes worth of question and answer from you all, and then we have a reception waiting for you in the back. I was not consulted on all of the features of the reception. I was told there was no alcohol, but I saw bottles of wine back there, so there will be alcohol. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of English and the Creative Writing Program, the Gender Studies Program, the Department of Africana Studies, and the Department of American Studies. I'd also like to thank Pauline Namalim, who's right here in the back. Please raise your hand. She is the administrative assistant for IRR, and without her tireless work to organize these events, all of this would be absolutely impossible. So thank you so much, Azareen. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. Pauline. Thank you, Azareen, too, but for stuff completely different. Going off script for just a second, the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters is here. Dr. Sarah Mustillo, and just as all of this would be impossible without Pauline, all of this would really be impossible without Sarah Mustillo. This is quite literally her brainchild, and so thank you, Sarah, for all of your work for many years to build this. I'd also like to thank the IRR student workers, Abijah Kabidi and Chloe Miller. I don't know if I saw them. I saw them earlier. They might be coming a little bit later. They said they had some work to do. They helped to develop the programming, our undergraduate programming for IRR, and they help research so that I have information in my introductions, not just platitudes. As many of you all have heard me say before, the Notre Dame Initiative on Race and Resilience consists of a community of scholars, students, artists, and activists united in the ongoing struggle to dismantle systemic racism and support communities of color. Global in scope, comparative, and interdisciplinary and critical approach, the initiative creates a space, intellectual, psychic, and now very soon physical, more on that later, where our members gather in solidarity to exchange ideas, develop projects, and celebrate the expressive cultures of communities of color. Ultimately, by confronting systemic racism and supporting communities of color, the Initiative on Race and Resilience will aid Notre Dame in its Catholic mission to cultivate, quote, a disciplined sensibility to the poverty, injustice, and oppression that burdens so many, end quote. We work to realize this vision through research, education, and community engagement. Furthermore, we strive to center the arts in all that we do, because we see the arts as a way of remaining fully alive to the impossible tension at the heart of the modern concept of race. Race as both a means of domination and exploitation, and race as a site of resistance, resilience, and recuperation. I am going to introduce our panelists very briefly. If I were to go into the biography and bibliography of everyone, that would just take up the rest of the time. So this is necessarily brief. To my far left is Professor Xavier Navarro Aquino. He is Assistant Professor of English and Creative Writing here at Notre Dame, and he is the author, among other publications, of the novel Velorio. Two people down from me is Dionne Bremyer. My introductions are in alphabetical order. They sat down as they've pleased. Professor Bremyer is an Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing here at Notre Dame, and she's the author, among other publications, of The Islands, Stories, and Quint, a novel. To her immediate left is Natasha Trethewey. Professor Trethewey is the Board of Trustees Professor of English in the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University, and she is the current IRR Artist in Residence. She is the author of, among other publications, Native Guard, Thrall, Monument, and Memorial Drive. And closest to me is Professor Azareen van der Vliet Oloomi. She is an Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at Notre Dame, and she is the author of, among other publications, Call Me Zebra and Savage Tongues. Collectively, these four writers have won numerous prizes, including the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Pulitzer Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and McDowell Fellowship, and have been reviewed in the New York Times Book Review. I easily could go on, but the point is that this is an illustrious group of writers, and we have so much to learn from their insights. Please join me in welcoming them. So this is truly meant to be a conversation, and so as my first prompt that I sent to everyone on the panel was to ask each person to reflect on this intersection of race or race and ethnicity and art more generally, but to begin specifically with their own literature. What role does what role does race or race and ethnicity play in your literature, and why? Xavier, would you like to start?
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a difficult question to answer, I think. When thinking about race, I come from the island of Puerto Rico, and so race in itself is a complicated history, and I would venture to guess that the role that race plays in my work is obviously essential, but it is one that was learned being away from the islands. Mostly because race on the island is a little bit different in how it's addressed and how it's spoken about. And that's not to say that there isn't racism. It's very obvious that there is a history of racism, but it's colorism. It's a complicated conversation when it comes to who gets the benefits of race on the island. So it wasn't a drastic shift in my approach to how I write until I came to the United States and I learned that I wasn't white, which is something that is evident, and a lot of Puerto Ricans who have migrated to the United States have felt a common affliction, especially those who present as Black. And so the history is sort of longstanding, and it obviously deals with how Puerto Ricans have moved through the spaces of New York City, moved through the spaces of Hawaii, moved through the spaces of Texas, and most recently Orlando, Florida. So to be as brief as possible, it is essential. It is something that I have learned. Racialized being in the United States because of its history, because of obviously the foundation of this country, and that obviously gets complicated with the status of what Puerto Rico means, what it means to be Puerto Rican, and how, in the most honest rendition, it's very likely that not many people understand Puerto Rico. Not many people understand sort of the political history that comes with Puerto Rico, and that we are, by default, especially those living on the island, second-class citizens. By its very nature, those that live on the island cannot vote for presidency. That's probably the most obvious example of that. So I don't want to get too sort of wrapped up in that conversation, but I would just say in its simplest form that it is something that I have been very, very aware of since I've lived in the United States.
When I think about race, I think about the history of America, the history of received knowledge and ideas about race across time and space. For me, I can't imagine how I would not write through a lens that includes something that has always been shot through in this country. I was born, as many of you might know, on Confederate Memorial Day, exactly 100 years to the day, that holiday to glorify the lost cause, white supremacy, the attempt to maintain slavery, all of those things, exactly 100 years to that day, daughter of an interracial marriage that was still illegal there and as many as 20 other places in the nation. For me, the specter of race and ideas about difference and hierarchy was right there in the hospital room, and it was there on the street when I left the hospital on my way home.
I feel like both of those answers are my answer. Oh, is it on? Yep. I think that as I think about my writing and race, it's hard for me to sort of parse them one from the other, right? I am a Black person and a Black writer, and so that deeply informs the work that I do. But I think also moving to the United States as a teenager, I really understood that difference of being Black in the United States and what it meant to be Black in the United States. And I think it's something I am still learning about all these years later, in spite of the 30 plus years I've lived in the US now. And so it's hard for me to think about what kind of writer I would be without being Black. I think those two things are intimately joined together. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who said to me very honestly, "I don't know why you keep writing these stories about Black characters. What are you doing? I don't get it." And that to me sort of spoke fundamentally to the way, well, of course they are, right? I am a Black writer, and so those two things are very closely linked together for me. I am a writer and I am a Black writer, and those two things are not separate.
Yeah, just to kind of, piggyback on that, I think it's really interesting the way that within the American literary context, we're asked to write literature that's rather disembodied, right? That's kind of the workshop setting, is, or to not think about history as something that resides in the body or that is made up of bodies. I'm personally really, my work is centered on migration and ethnicity. I am Iranian American. I was born in the United States, but left immediately, was raised in Iran, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Spain, and so returned to the United States as a citizen and an immigrant, and encountered all kinds of, ethnic and political violence in my family. And, also realized that in this context, I'm not white. There's lots of kind of complex ethnic and linguistic, religious, dynamics in the Iranian context. A lot of colorism. There's, ethnicity and race. And just for me, as someone who's moved in a global context, I think of my writing as a relationship of reciprocity with the world, and as something, language as something that's incredibly capacious and able to excavate the things that we're asked to silence or to oppress, because they're actually triggering for people when we start to really explore. So that's where I come from.
I know this is supposed to be a conversation, so I want to jump in and converse, because of Dionne's story just reminded me of this. I visited Dionne's class last night, and I told this, and now I know that you have this same history. I had a professor in graduate school tell me to unburden myself of being Black, unburden myself of the death of my mother, and just write about something else, the situation in Northern Ireland. Just pour your heart out in the poems. And the idea that part of who I am and what I have been given was the thing that he was telling me to unburden myself of. And I wonder if anyone said to the late James Tate, unburden yourself of being white and just write about something else.
Thank you. Each one of you all has kind of touched on the complexities of race as such, and I should have said at the top, we're sliding back and forth between race and ethnicity in a kind of sloppy way, but to make room for the kinds of complexities that particularly Azareen is pointing to. And in a larger context, this is something that we've wrestled with from the very beginning when we were writing the proposal for IRR, and something that we continue to wrestle with, both in an American context and thinking globally as well. So thank you for that complication, and we'll continue to explore that. Would each one of you, just race aside, if that's possible, you don't have to kind of bracket race, but talk to us about why you write. What is the motivation? What is the vision for your writing? What is the inspiration? And what do you hope to give to your audience? We don't have to go in the same order, anybody.
Yeah, this is gonna sound more grim than I mean it, but my writing started as an act of mourning. Mourning a lot of the losses of exile, and even something that we might take for granted, like deciding or not deciding to have children, right? And what language do you speak to your children, and how do you pass your ancestral language on? And what does it mean to not do that, right? And the burden and responsibility of a choice like that. Those are all things that I don't know, that's one example, but I don't know where else to work through those questions than in my writing. So a lot of it is sort of about grief and mourning, but also thinking about how through human history we've created meaning and transformed loss into something transcendent or joyful or relational, understanding just the power of the collective spirit. And I really do believe that literature does that. I mean, there's no national boundaries. It travels, right? You can't, they've tried to police and censor, right, how literature travels and moves across the world, but you really can't. And I think that it's really subversive and a place where I can also be really mischievous and absurd and joyful. So it helps me to kind of learn how to really fundamentally say yes to life after, enormous losses, and writers that I love to read have taught me how to do that, and it's a practice, really.
I love that answer, Azareen. It's so beautiful. I think that that writing for me is both driven by a kind of deep empathy, but also thinking about how we complicate the narratives of lots of different kinds of people. I'm going to kind of butcher the quote, but it's Alexander Solzhenitsyn who says, you know, that regimes hate good writers, right? They really like poor ones, right? Because writers are inherently political, and that the act of writing is an inherently political act. And I think that is part of why I write, in part because of a desire to be political in a way that engenders a kind of empathy, and that so much of my work is centered around thinking about the lived experiences of different kinds of people. On a really more basic level, too, I think that, you know, growing up, my family is Jamaican, and all the depictions I saw, I think, of Jamaicans in popular culture were, you know, minstrel-like almost, you know. I mean, it was really this one sort of depiction of what it meant to be Jamaican. And I knew that that experience was more complicated and much more layered and much more tragic in so many ways than it had been depicted in popular culture. And I felt like those stories were really important to tell.
I've always been interested in history and memory and memorialization. The intersections and contentions between public history and our collective cultural memory, and what is left out of the historical record, what is erased, what is not included on the monumental landscape in the received knowledge that has been passed down for centuries. And so one of the things I do is I write to try to push back against that and to reinscribe those things which have been lost. I also write, you know, James Baldwin wrote, "This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art." And so writing for me, too, is a way to contend with so much of the chaos and disorder that is both personal and national, our personal and national wounds. I'm an elegiac poet, and so contending with grief, again, both personal and national, is another reason that I write. And I'm reminded in the making of a poem what Shelley wrote, that poems are the records of the best and happiest times and the happiest and best minds. And so writing is a way to make a thing and to be joyful.
Well, that's, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how I can best answer that without repeating what's been already said. I write because I can. And I say this taking inspiration from Chris Abani's essay, which I have taught, and my students who may be in the crowd understand this. It's an essay that tries to interrogate what art means for the artist. It's an essay published in 2012, so it's been a while, but I've always found it very enlightening because he sort of goes through the motions of multiple aspects of creating, uses a little bit of theory and whatnot. But by the end of it, he's often trying to think about or trying to ask his students, why do they write? Which is an essential question, I think, that every artist has to contend with at some point. And I write because I can, and I say this because my own personal history writing was not in my plans. I didn't grow up a voracious reader. I sort of grew up loving music, loving art, visual art, and loving sports, and I'm happy to claim that. so there were many things that I imagined myself being growing up, right, and wanted to be a basketball player, but I realized that nobody in my family was like above 5'8". 6 would have been good. 6 would have meant I had a chance, right? But no, I didn't. So there were a lot of things that I imagined myself being. Writing just kept coming back to me, and I think over time it was an essential product of all my circumstances that led me to this point. And the one thing that has often carried me is community. And I'm not talking specifically of sort of Puerto Rican community, but I'm talking about regional community, Caribbean community. And it was a gift that was given to me when I returned back after doing my bachelor's to the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, sort of trying to contextualize how we fit within the fabric of our region beyond just Latin America, because there's always this conversation in Puerto Rico that deals with sort of identity, deals with what do we relate ourselves with, whether we're American. Obviously, we have our citizenship there, but we have our colonial history of Spanish history. But I was often perplexed that it was never at the forefront having a conversation of how we're Caribbean and how we, right next to us, we have all our fellow brothers and sisters, and we sort of siloed ourselves. Obviously, that's sort of the short end. It's a colonial construct. But it always returned back to me, this concept that I found community mostly through poetry, through the poets that I've been able to cross paths with, and really realizing the urgency of the region and how essential it is that the Caribbean is seen as a vital component of the conversation that deals with race, that deals with history, that deals with modernity, sort of broadly speaking. So I write because I can, but I can imagine multiple lives where I could have been a rock star. And that seems nice sometimes because writing is hard and it's a difficult task to embark on because it's a lonely task in the process of creating. And then, the returns aren't often easy to see. They're not easy.
No, you're fine. Well, Xavier, could we just linger on that for just a second? I'm going to ask the same question for everyone, but I'd really like to start with you because you've given us, that's the most recent kind of articulation, but each one of you has given us so much to think about. And could you read through your answer to why you write through your most recent publication? So, Velorio. Why Velorio? Why did you write that novel as opposed to something else? And how does that reflect what you just said? Memorial Drive. I think I know the answer, but I would love to hear it from you. Dionne, if you would pick, and each one of you all, let's not assume I've read them. Let's not assume everyone has read all that you all have written. So give us a sense of what the work is in a larger sense, and then read through that larger answer you just gave us through the piece. And so if you would pick out, give us a sense of kind of what the larger collection is, and then zero in on one that helps to articulate what you just said, and then Savage Tongues. Same thing. Is that workable? So Xavier, why don't you start?
Well, like all things, Velorio is a novel that I didn't want to write. And I say this because I've still been working on the same project where it feels like too long, and I'm sort of wondering whether or not I should abandon the project that I'm currently working on. But Velorio came at a time of necessity. It is about a reimagining of a post-dystopic island of Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the hurricane, and it really draws from inspirations of obviously William Faulkner and how it's delivered, Lord of the Flies. Sort of those are just the basic components of it. But it's a cast of characters, so 7 characters that have survived the hurricane and are trying to figure out how to find purpose in an island that has been depleted of resources, that has been depleted of government control. So it really is a fiction, and I always stress that because sometimes it's misread as like historical fiction, which it couldn't be farther from the truth. It's not historical in any way in that frame. But it came about in thinking. So I draw from multiple poets in the book itself. There's a character that wants to be a poet, and so maybe that's a reflection of how I wanted to be a poet growing up, and I failed at it in some ways. But he makes references to obvious Julia de Burgos, and he makes references to Derek Walcott's The Schooner Flight, which is a seminal work in Caribbean studies. And then specifically, the poet in the book is trying to uncover and rediscover what it means to be Puerto Rican on the island, what it means to be Puerto Rican without any sort of structural support. So the way I imagine that book is a complicated relationship that I have with that book. I'm grateful for it, but it's one that I set out not wanting to write because it was a difficult thing to write about. And I think most Puerto Ricans that experienced the storm, whether directly or indirectly, found it difficult to find language to attach to that sort of cataclysm. And so I set out to write it 2 years after the storm, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I like unconventional narratives, and I found that a lot of the conversations that were revolving around the hurricane were obviously based on realism, reflected on sort of elements of realism, but how do we discuss sort of colonialism or neocolonialism without imagining sort of absurd situations or really weird distortions of the future? And I think that was a component of how I came about in thinking of the novel. In thinking about how race plays into the book itself, it is quite obvious, and this is part of sort of the colorism and the racism on the island, is that those who don't have the resources or access to the resources are clearly people of color. And on the island, it's pretty evident when you see that. You see that structurally, you see that in sort of the systems of government, of how who you see is clearly a reflection in some ways of how the United States also functions, or how other entities work through. So I won't talk too much about the book, but it is a strange little book that sort of negotiates this conversation of what it means to be Puerto Rican in 2020 something, and then I leave that up to whomever wants to look through it.
So my most recent book, Memorial Drive, is a memoir. It is an elegy. It is a long prose poem to my mother, but also about why I write. Because in it, I find that my two existential wounds are met. If I began wanting to write because of the history of white supremacy in America, all those things that manifest in my parents' relationship and my birth when it was illegal, and the years of growing up in the Deep South, and the monuments to the Confederacy and the erasure of other histories, if that was the first reason I wrote, the first existential wound, the second one came later when I was 19 and my mother was murdered. And what I realized in writing Memorial Drive is the way that those two things were connected. My mother died in the shadow of Stone Mountain, the world's largest monument to the Confederacy. And the stark contrast of what is writ large on our monumental landscape and the small individual death that I wanted to realign the world so that hers was large and important, not just to me, bigger than that monument that oversaw her dying.
Thank you. I think that one of the reasons that I wrote The Islands was thinking about the idea of Jamaica as a place both real and imagined. I've never lived in Jamaica, but it so deeply informs every part of who I am. My mother says that our family motto is "We move," and both my grandparents immigrated from Jamaica. My parents immigrated from Jamaica, and I was born in Canada, but I too am an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States. And so that idea of like movement and liminality is a big part of the work of The Islands, which tells the stories of Jamaican women living in all different parts of the world. Thinking about, how and why to tell those stories was really important, especially as I started in college looking at Caribbean Lit and reading, amazing stories, by Caribbean authors, but not necessarily thinking about, the story of the diaspora. And so, the Jamaican diaspora, which is all over the world, made up of millions of people, more than there are on the island itself. And so those are important and different kinds of stories to tell as well. And I really wanted to tell some of those stories. I think one of the things that's maybe a little bit different about my own personal story in terms of my connection to Jamaica is how I grew up. So I grew up in Toronto, and my parents owned one of the first Jamaican groceries in the Greater Toronto area. And I grew up working in that store, which inspired the second story in my collection, Shop Girl. And I had wanted to tell that story for so long and tried to figure out how to tell the story of what it meant to kind of grow up in these two different places simultaneously, where, I understood Jamaica so intimately from spending every weekend working in the store. But I also very much, was a little Canadian girl and watched Hockey Night in Canada and ate craft dinner and did all those things. And that those two experiences lived simultaneous for me in my consciousness. And so, that story is told in second person and covers a really long period of time. And it's the shortest story in the collection, even though it covers such a long period of time. But it's a way to sort of get at kind of that experience of my childhood, to think about all of these things and contextualize them and think about what it meant for me to sort of live in those two different places at once, and think about how that really reflected and reflects the liminality of the immigrant experience. When you leave a place, in some ways it's stuck in your memory and your mind and that moment in time forever. And it's what makes it so hard, right? Because you can't ever go back to it again. It's once you have left that moment in time, it's done, even though the place continues to grow and change and evolve, right? And yet the new place you're in is not home either, right? It is always a place in which you will feel outside. And so you can't go home again, and yet this new place isn't your home either. And what does it mean to live a life in liminal space, to live a life where maybe there is no home, or the home has to be what you make it with people or emotions, and less about place and space.
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer with Savage Tongues. It's a pretty autofictional novel, and it really follows two women in their 30s who are best friends against many odds, one Iranian American and one Israeli, raised very Orthodox. And both of the female protagonists have really left the kind of oppressive gender constraints of their cultures of origin behind, and that leaving behind of tradition and entering into a kind of vulnerable space in the American landscapes makes them both exposed to intimate violence and sexual violence. And the story begins with, the narrator's brother who's violently attacked in the United States. And then sets off a series of ripple effects, and the attack has everything to do with this sense of liminality, though it's different for me and for the characters I write about, which are all ethnically, culturally hybrid, right? So full of contradictions, maybe parts of themselves that can't fully be integrated. And this existential struggle for all the characters in the book is to learn to actually live with those complexities without having that drive we have as humans, which is to resolve those conflicts, right? To just allow them to coexist. And so the two women travel back together to southern Spain, to Andalusia, which is a historically Muslim space and Sephardic space. So I always like to say, like, we think Europe is not Islamic. Europe is deeply Islamic, deeply Sephardic, right? And so I'm thinking in the book a lot about deep history. One of the things that really shocked me when I came to America was just the dissociative nature of world conception, right? The way that we're actually encouraged to think dissociatively about history and where we all come from, how we all ended up here, that we are a nation of exiles, right? And cause of a lot of displacement and occupation. And so the two women it's really an overheard conversation between these two women who are deep best friends and who are just talking through these things with each other. And through that talking of rewriting and going back and forth and attaching language to things, healing occurs, but it's not the kind of, giant healing that we would expect of a novel with this like epiphanic resolution at the end. It's just moving things, micro movements towards forgiveness and acceptance and moving away from self-loathing. So it's I guess non-narrative in some ways, which when I was in grad school, I was always told, like, nothing is happening in your work. And I was like, no, stuff is happening. You just can't hear it. So I kept going.
We're all better professors than that, right?
Yes, one would hope. If we aren't, I hope our students tell us. Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to ask one more question for all four, and then it's your turn. And so I hope that you all have questions as well, and we have microphones at the end of each aisle. And so my last question is more kind of mechanical. What role does the marketplace and the publishing industry play on your craft, your vision for your individual, the works that you produce, and how you produce it? And if race has a role in that, we'd love to hear it. If it doesn't, that's fine too. Anyone can start.
Very nice.
I should say race and gender.
So I guess this is a two-part answer. I talked a little bit about this, I think, in your class last night, too. I think that it's a marketing kind of thing. When I started out, and when I mean start, I mean imagining myself becoming a writer, studying the craft, beginning to publish poems. And that's when I had that professor tell me what he told me, effectively saying, don't write about the things that you're writing about. And so the decision that I made back then was to look outward always at history. If he didn't like my personal story, I think I felt that he'd be forced to contend with the facts of history. And I also turned to writing a lot more poems in traditional forms, because I also thought that that would be a way to make it such that he could not ignore my poems just because he didn't like the subject matter, because I was using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Many years later, when I published my collection of poems, Native Guard, writing exactly about the two things he told me to unburden myself of, that book won a Pulitzer Prize. Now, after that, I had a much bigger audience, and so that changes, how a publisher sees you and whether or not how they'll market your book, whether or not they'll get behind it for all sorts of things. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that poet's really likable. The book begins with elegies. The book then moves into history and then into personal history. I felt like audiences could like that poet who wrote that book. But my next book is a much harder book in some ways, because it is trying to contend with the forces of white supremacy and received knowledge across time and space. From the very beginning, people have said that I write about race, when what I'm really doing is writing about history and the history of knowledge and knowledge production around ideas of race. When I wrote Thrall, my fourth book, I decided to show you what it was really like if I write about race. But still, I was writing about history and received knowledge and the Enlightenment, and going back to the 13th century even. When I wrote that book, I could not imagine that that person was as likable as the person who wrote Native Guard, and could not have ever imagined that that person would become the Poet Laureate of the United States. And when I did, because of that book, I thought, oh, I've been given the validation to be exactly the poet that I am. And I think that feels like my message to the market as well as the market's message to me.
The market. Yes, it does put pressure on artists, especially if it's one that sort of you find yourself working with a larger publisher. I've been fortunate, at least for this book. We'll see how it sort of works out throughout. There's never really a linear path. But I was fortunate to come across a group of people, whether it's agents or editors, that understood the work without being driven sort of from market pressure. And that sort of has its own complicated conversation, especially when it comes to sort of finances and money. And I won't go too deep into it. When it comes to what books are sort of pushed up, it's often a lot of money is driving sort of buzz and things of that nature, and then seldomly you start to see books that sort of hold their own weight without those sort of influences. But it is real, and it is something that in my own classes, when I'm teaching and I talk to my students, especially my graduate students, I'm making them aware of these forces, but not to write towards those forces, but to understand that they're there. And that once that understanding is there, then the question falls on the artist to ask themselves, what are you going to do with that information, right? Are you going to still pursue how you want to write, which is obviously the most, that's the answer that I like to hear. But there's also the alternative, which is, well, you can sort of modify to fit a certain structure, a certain respectability of what it means to be that demographic, because writers of color are often sort of pigeonholed into certain boxes, and the most that I think we can hope to accomplish is that we push back against it. And sometimes, depending on our platforms, we're given more leniency or not of what we're able or allowed to do in our work. But these are all conversations that are sort of individualized to the specific experience. But I would say that overall, yes, the market does play a factor in what it's trying to project to writers. The question then falls on whether or not we want to sort of satisfy those check boxes, right? That if, for example, if you're Puerto Rican, well, then you need to sort of perform Latinidad or Puerto Ricanness in sort of some capacity that is familiar to a reading audience, which is something that I don't like doing, and I've never felt an essential duty to do, which is probably why I get mixed reactions from my book, even from my own community. Because I've never been interested in that, and I think that obviously stems from where I've come from, and that is my home, and I don't feel sort of that rift between that community, and so even when they can turn and say those things, I can still say, well, I'll love you even if you don't love me back, and that's the work that I do in my overall project, is just thinking about my work in the context of sort of the larger structure of those who have paved the path before us. And it really helps, and it matters when there are artists and writers that have broken down boundaries, whether it's through form, or whether it's through content, because then we can obviously turn to those artists and say, well, they're doing it. You should give me that level of respect. It's probably the fastest way of saying it, that level of respect. So, not to dissuade those aspiring writers, but it is there, and it is a force that we must negotiate with or just completely ignore.
I have been talking about this with my graduate students a lot this semester, and thinking about these ideas of market. So I can tell you, I said to my husband after like the book got sent out for final edits, like, well, that's done. Nobody's going to read it. And, you know, I felt that way because I was like, I don't know who but me and like, I don't know, maybe my sister, if she's in a good mood, like actually would want to read these stories. And so, you know, I really felt like I don't know who's necessarily interested in reading them. They felt so personal and about, you know, a small segment of people. That's been one of the joys of going out with the book, that I've gotten to talk to different people who the stories have hit in different and interesting ways. But I also think that there's a lot of ways to think about that idea of market, in that you also have to think about like your career as an artist. And I asked Natasha this last night in class. We were looking at a book, what was it, 2002, when Bellic Ophelia came out, and we were talking about that in Memorial Drive and thinking about that idea of like, what does it mean with these books that are, you know, 18 years apart, and how have you grown and changed as an artist? And she said, you know, you're always writing about your obsessions, which I thought was very perceptive. But I think that idea of the length of your career also means that it can't just be about writing for market, right? Like, there has to be a reason to do the work that is not just about money. Unpopular opinion, maybe, but I think also that, you know, I think all of us probably would still write even if there weren't necessarily checks involved with it. I think there's something beyond the money that compels writers to write. I also think that, you know, one of the things that was interesting when my agent was sending out the collection is I had a bigger publishing house that was interested in the book. And I remember talking with the editor, and he said, I love this collection. It's all about millennial malaise. And I was like, what is he talking about? Did he even read the book? I remember getting off the phone and telling my agent afterwards, what in the world is he talking about? Like, no, I don't have any interest in working with them because he doesn't know what the book is about. And, I went with a smaller publisher, but my editor was amazing, and she really got in that first conversation what the book was about, what the book was trying to do. And she's a great editor, but she's not, a heavy praise editor. She was very brusque with me, but I think that's the kind of abuse that I'm used to, and so that was okay with me. And so, I think that one of the things that really drew me to her was that she really understood what I was trying to do with the book. Not because she's Jamaican, not because, that was her community, but she understood the book intensely and wanted to see it out there in the world. And, I don't know that necessarily had to do with market. I think she was just passionate about the book. And so, you have to kind of do the work that you're going to do regardless, And I wrote these stories over a long period of time, and I think each time I wrote one of these stories, I was like, well, here's another story I've written for myself, and I don't know who will want to read it, and that's okay, And so I think that in some ways there's two different questions that you're thinking of as a writer, and one in some ways has nothing to do with you. It's about capitalism and money and agents, and that's a whole different thing than like sitting down in front of the computer and doing the work. And like you kind of have to do that before you worry about the other thing.
Yeah, I agree. You just have to take the long view, and I think there is a lot of pressure to kind of, I was thinking about the word unburden, to unburden them of history, right? That's what's really being asked, and to justify your existence. But the level of commitment that each book requires of the writer to kind of return to yourself in a new or deeper way, or in a more kind of expansive way, the marketplace has it tries to puncture your privacy with your work, but you really have to kind of be very disciplined around that, and it's not easy. I think finding the right editor and the right agent is so key, and it's just a combination of like really hard work and luck and perseverance. But for like, something happened recently with Call Me Zebra, which is my second novel, where some of you may know there's a lot of upheaval and protests in Iran, and there's a lot of censorship. There's actually like a censorship office in Iran, and turns out Call Me Zebra was in the censorship office, and it had been completely blacklisted, and a bunch of Iranian translators who have been put in jail, executed, tortured, sometimes for nothing, They all decided in the phase of the recent protests to sign a letter that was public saying that they were going to translate whatever they wanted and disseminate it publicly from now on. And this young translator translated Call Me Zebra in its entirety, like with sex scenes, with a lot of political manifesto literature embedded in it, and just put it out there, and it's been circulating. And I didn't even know that the book was in the censorship office. I knew that I'm better not try to go home. I could arrive at that by myself, but it was just such an incredible moment, and that's not a moment that my American editor or agent could gift me. Obviously they facilitated by helping put the work out in the world, but the power of that, and the privilege of that, right? Because I left, I'm here, and I'm safe in ways that they aren't, and I'm unsafe in ways that they aren't, right? It's a very different paradigm. But yeah, I think we just have to kind of, be authentic, and I really mean that in the very deep sense of the word,
Thank you all. The floor is now open. You do need to get up and come to one of these microphones. We are live streaming, so even if you project very well, you will not be heard at home if you're not in front of a speaker. So please don't feel shy. Come forward, ask your questions, let us know who you are, and come and ask your question.
Can I just ask my question then? So I'm really excited to see this entire panel up there today because Azareen, Dionne, Xavier, you represent my time at Notre Dame in creative writing. Natasha, every time I hear you speak, I learn something new and really poignant, so thank you. I have my intro to creative writing students here today, and for a lot of them, I think the idea of sort of diving into creative writing is very new, and they've been great sports with all of the prompts I've thrown at them. But I am just curious if you could speak to protecting yourself as a writer, because I think there's a tendency, whether you're starting out or whether you're writing for the market or things like that, authenticity or powerful writing almost forces you to be vulnerable in a way that's uncomfortable, it's dangerous mentally, emotionally, physically. So I wonder if you can just speak to this idea of protecting yourself as a writer.
I think, building up to vulnerability is a really important process, and it is really the job of the instructor to create a safe space and to very subtly navigate and be sensitive to subtle forms of violence. And sometimes in workshop settings, students who aren't able to receive certain work won't necessarily even speak, but body language can go a really long way. And so I think of our work as like, honestly, I feel like I'm just like a mother eagle, like in the classroom, just trying to read the energy in the room constantly. And, I personally have one really funny story from grad school when I was told that, and to sort of like, there's nothing happening here. I was actually told by another student that my narrator was sleepwalking and had no willpower or agency. That's a huge philosophical statement, right, to make about an Iranian narrator. And, how do we have agency and how do we have willpower and what does that mean in each cultural setting, right? And so I just decided to bring fake work into workshop for the rest of the semester. And so I wrote this series called The Adventures of Naked Frank. And it was all about a guy walking around naked. He woke up in the morning, he died at the end of the day, he resurrected and did it all over again. And they loved it. So, there's a time and a place, but now I just go for it, and it hurts. Like writing Savage Tongues, it hurt. But you have to build that up, and you have to have good mentors and good teachers. It is our job to protect young writers who are learning to do that work with themselves, for sure.
I really like the constraints of form, the elegant envelope of form of a sentence, of a sonnet. Something else that Shelley said, poetry is a mirror that makes beautiful that which is distorted. So trying to contend with the things that render me vulnerable, I can do in a form when I have constraints. Because at that moment, whatever the distorted thing is that is making me need to write the poem, I'm in control of it because I'm in control of the language. I'm in control of something that I wasn't in control of when I was experiencing it. Which is why, when I am within the constraints of form, I have a kind of armor on. But when I have to talk like this, I don't.
I would jokingly just say, don't hang out with other writers. just my experience. But in thinking of how to answer your question, Jacob, I think for me it goes back to the beginning question of why do we write? And I think when we return to that, we have some pillar that we can lean on, some light that we're aware of. So it's an essential, I think, question that I always try to, as Azareen said, create an environment for our students that are aware of the sensitivities and the histories that each of them bring to the conversation. But most importantly, the reason why I start my classes off with that essay is because it tries to interrogate the reason why we're even doing this. And if you can really find that reason, and it's a genuine reason and one that you're honest with yourself about, hopefully that is part of the many pillars that you can lean on when things get tough. Because vulnerability is part of the vocation, I think. And you can't protect yourself from all the external forces that are going to come at your work and then by extension at you. So those sort of essential things are some of the things that I advise to my students, is thinking about that essential question. Try to just be friends with a couple of writers and then do wellness for yourself. I think it's an important habit that all artists should occupy, especially if it's work that is personal or work that is personal in nature. It's going to take a lot from you. So just really managing that space, I think, is critical.
So I may be redundant but I'm going to keep going. So in maybe building on vulnerability and maybe self-care, two quick asides that hopefully you'll comment on. I heard part of a dialogue between Saidiya Hartman and Dionne Brand at a symposium of refusal at Columbia. And Brand makes this statement kind of as an epiphany about having a consciousness of her being by realizing, as if in that moment, but we know it's from a poem she's written, that I'm here because they were there, talking about the legacy of being an African-descended person. And in hearing you all and thinking about the vulnerability and the way that all of you have these layered identities that are very complicated and sometimes disjunctive, I was remembering I used to be part of the Afro-Latino Forum in New York City when Juan Flores and Miriam Ramon were still alive. And I'll never forget, there was a young guy who was close to Dionne's color, and he stood up and he said, I gotta get this right, I'm Puerto Rican, living in Texas. I'm seen as a N-word. My parents call themselves Dominican because Dominicans can also not be black, and they're comfortable that way, and I need to know who I am. And even just saying it, it's very upsetting, you know? And I have my own stories like that. And so I'm thinking about this idea of vulnerability, not for your students, but your self-care. And maybe it is with other writers. I don't know, but how do you, because I was really taken, I almost burst into tears, Natasha, when you had the last statement you made a few minutes ago, because I could really feel the transparency. And how do you continue? Because all of you have a strong weight that you're having to wrestle with to get to the page. And I'm just curious if you want to comment at all. You don't have to.
I think in some ways, like there's like two selves, and I don't know if other writers feel this way, but for me, there are always these two selves, and there's the part of me that sort of operates publicly in the world and the part of me that writes. And there's overlap between those two things, obviously, but in some ways I like to keep them sort of running on parallel tracks, you know. And you know, Mark introduced me as Dr. Bremyer, right? But you'll see my book says Irving on it. So that's like one separation of church and state for me. You know, like that, you know, there are these kind of separations that they make. And those are, I think in some ways those are actually very purposeful. That the work that I do as a writer in some ways has to be very separate from the ways that I move through the world, because I need to insulate myself from some of what happens on the page. And I loved what Natasha said about there being some control, right, on the page with language. I think that is absolutely very true for me as a writer. You know, it's why I think writing has often felt like a safe space, because it is a place over which I can enact a degree of control, especially when there were other places in my life that I could not. And so, you know, I think there are times where that overlap comes, right, between myself as a writer and myself sort of as a person in the world. But I also think there's ways that I actually try to keep them very discreet, you know. It's why writing nonfiction is really hard, right? Because you write something for nonfiction, and then people get up and ask you personal questions about your life, and you're like, I don't know you, right? Like, you know, don't ask me that. And so, I mean, I think that's, and there's also like a real separation, right? Because when you're sitting and doing the work, I think, even of nonfiction, you're not necessarily thinking, well, somebody's going to ask me about, you know, these very intimate things. But then you have this in this space where you have to kind of be public about it. And that's, I think that's where especially the project of nonfiction becomes really difficult. You know, that fiction also provides for me, and maybe poetry to an extent, there's a little bit of distance, right, between the work and you. But I think especially with nonfiction, people will get up and just will ask you any super personal thing that I want to ask you because you've written it down, so it must be open season then. And that's, you know, that's very hard. And it's, I think, sometimes also made me like reticent about publishing nonfiction, because it opens you up to different kinds of things than I think poetry and fiction do.
I mean, I'll just be brief. And again, going back to Walcott, if you can't tell, I like his poetry. In the Schooner Flight, he says in the second stanza, either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. I think that's probably the best way I would summarize that.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for such an illuminating and thoughtful conversation. I have a question about audience, not audience as a market, but audience as a relationship. I'm wondering if, as writers, you have an imagined audience for whom you write or who shapes the way you write. There was a book written some years ago by, I think, Robert Graves called The Reader Over Your Shoulder. And I'm wondering if you have a reader or readers over your shoulder that influence the choices you make as writers. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the two questions are really connected for me. Writing is actually the space where I think who I am and what I write are the same, exactly the same. And that's why it's so difficult. You know, I lost my brother a couple of months ago, and it had everything to do with the incident of violence that he experienced when we first moved here. And it stripped me down completely, so it's very difficult to kind of write with layers of masks on after that. I mean, I don't think I was doing a good job of separating things before that, but so when I think about the audience, it's different for every book. I think for Call Me Zebra, it was my ancestors, you know. They were reading over my shoulder. And when I was writing Savage Tongues, it was my brother. And that's the relationship I'm in, and those are the relationships that keep me honest on the page. I can't control at all what happens outside of that, but I'm always amazed and surprised at who speaks back. And it's actually made me really very curious about all kinds of people, because when you're on the road, you thought no one was gonna read The Islands, and so many people are reading it and thinking about it and writing to you. And it's often people you would never expect. And I think that's that joy that writing has, that reminder that you're alive and that you can make something of that. Yeah.
I adhere to the motto that clarity is revolutionary, and because I want the largest audience possible, I always think about trying to be as accessible as possible to the widest range of people.
So this will be our last question.
Hi, my name is Mary. So just on the topic of, actually someone had mentioned joy, I was curious, because I feel like when there's so many, especially when it comes to talking about the intersections of, race and trauma and all of that, how do you celebrate your identities within your writing, whether it's through form or just through the diving into your characters, because I think that's a really, really important part of being able to stay authentic as well. So.
Well, I think in some ways, and this kind of goes back to John's question too, I guess, about audience, and in some ways, like these stories are stories for my son, and they're stories that I would want him to know, and they're stories that to me are important parts of telling like the story of his culture and his family, and they're not always happy stories, but they, to me, knowing yourself and knowing where you're from is a privilege, and we forget what a privilege it is to know yourself and know where you're from. And I think there's so many of us, especially those of us with enslaved ancestors who don't know where we're from and don't know our stories. And so there's joy to me in sort of telling those stories and having those as an artifact for him so that he can go in the world and have a story of his people and where he's from.
I'll share one last thing. I think humor is really important for me, particularly the gift of being from the Middle East is a sense of absurdism, deep absurdism, where everything that's happened to you has been happening for millions of years. You're not special. And there's like a deep sense of allegory to everything. And so, my characters are often, laughing even at their own fate, right? And there's this idea of being one of the lucky unlucky, and that's kind of what I keep coming back to. So there's a lot of laughter and joy in my books, and that, I think that's really a celebration of my culture.
Thank you all so much. When we were designing IRR, we had such high hopes, and Sarah said, just blue sky, right? Whatever it is that you ultimately envision, and we'll try to make it happen. And we were envisioning moments like this. It's really an amazing moment where your wildest fantasies become manifest. Thank you so much for your art. Thank you so much for your wisdom. And thank you for your time and speaking with us. Can you join me in thanking our panelists? And please stick around for the reception just out the doors here.